We are very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Cassandra Cross. This is her first time speaking at BSides, hopefully not her last time. And her talk is on understanding the reality of fraud victimisation. So let's all welcome Cassandra to the stage with a big round of applause.
All right, good morning everyone. How are we feeling? This is quite exciting to be in a room with actual people, and despite the fact all these bright lights means I can't see you, it's just exciting to have people in 3 dimensions. Shout out to all my fellow Queenslanders who had that mild panic attack that I had just before Easter when we had the snap lockdown in Brisbane. So didn't think that this would be a reality. But it's really nice to be here in person. I'm thankful for the opportunity to come. I'm thankful that I'm not presenting with my laptop on an ironing board at 2 a.m. in my lounge room, which is what I've been doing quite recently. So today I'm here to talk about fraud victimisation. This is an area that I've been in for a while. I'm currently a senior research fellow with the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre. I'm also an associate professor in the School of Justice at QUT. And I first started researching fraud back in 2008, so it's been a while. Sadly, it hasn't gotten better, it's gotten worse if anything. Today I'm not here to give a technical talk, but what I am here to do is share with you some of the insights from the research that I've done and hopefully get you to think about this topic in perhaps a different way. If there's one thing that you can hopefully take from it, it's just the understanding of what fraud actually is, what fraud victimisation, the reality of it, I guess given in the title, and to maybe get you to think about it slightly differently. So firstly, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on where we meet today. I also acknowledge the traditional owners, the Yagara and Turrbal people where I live and work up in Brisbane. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, partially because I can't see you, but how many people have received kind of fraudulent emails in their inboxes? I'd imagine pretty well everyone in the room has received some type of fraudulent email soliciting funds, soliciting personal information, soliciting all types of things. They vary around the types of approaches. I'll talk about it a few slides' time. But in terms of 1 to 10 levels of outrageousness, this is probably one of my favourites. So this one is from the early 2000s, but it surfaced again around 2016. And it's about the Nigerian astronaut who is stuck in space and requires $3 million in order to get home. He's been stuck in space for about 14 years and needs some money to come home. So, I mean, this is clearly not true. This is quite an outrageous, ridiculous type of email. I'm sure there probably were some people that did respond to this, whether in seriousness or whether in jest. I'm not sure how much money was made off this particular approach. But when we think about fraudulent emails, when we think about scams, we generally think about kind of the outrageous ones. We think about the Nigerian prince who became a Nigerian astronaut. But I guess what I want to talk about today is the fact that that's not actually the reality for many individuals. These aren't the responses, these aren't the approaches that many people respond to. They're in fact a lot more nuanced, a lot more sophisticated, and a lot more complex. So in terms of fraud, just quick definition, it's all about financial advantage. It's all about an offender being able to gain a financial advantage through lying, through cheating, through deception. And I guess that at the core of fraud, it's about getting people to send money under circumstances that they wouldn't ordinarily send it. So one of the challenges with fraud victimisation is that victims are active participants. So they are transferring money, they are responding to emails, they are sending personal information. But I guess my counter to that is that they're doing it under false pretenses. They wouldn't ordinarily do it if they knew the truth. If we think about fraud, there's so many different ways to perpetrate it. I will cover a few of them. The financial advantage is usually through a direct monetary transfer, but it can also be around personal information. Everyone in this room knows how important personal credentials are and what they can be used for in order to gain other lines of credit. If we think about categories of fraud, I've argued in some of my research that there's endless plot lines. So offenders are really innovative, they're really creative persons, and they can use anything, any type of approach in order to craft something, in order to try and target someone. So unsurprisingly in 2020, we saw a lot of COVID-19 related frauds and scams. Earlier this year, when Australia started the vaccine rollout, I know that that's a hot topic for today, but when that first started back in March, immediately we saw approaches where there were emails going out to people telling them they had to pay money in order to jump a queue in order to get a vaccine. So offenders will use any circumstance possible. Early 2020, I was writing about bushfires and the frauds that were related to that. And I very quickly kind of transitioned, offenders very quickly transitioned to COVID-19 in March 2020. And whatever's coming up in 2021, I don't want to jinx it, but whatever is coming up the rest of this year, offenders will be on top of that as well. But despite the variety of the approaches, there will always be a request for money or personal information. I mean, that's the essence of fraud. That's why offenders do it. They're doing it for that financial advantage. The most common categories are around advanced fee fraud. Many of you may have heard that term. It's essentially when someone's asked to send a small amount of money for a larger amount in return. It's quite often around lotteries, around investments, around inheritances. Romance fraud is when offenders use the guise of a legitimate relationship. I've done a lot of work in this space. I'm currently analysing 3,500 reports from ScamWatch around romance fraud victimisation. For me, it's the saddest type of victimisation because it plays at the core of who we are as humans, around our desire to connect and have relationships. And it's difficult for individuals to not only grieve the financial losses, but to grieve that loss of a relationship and the betrayal and violation that goes along with that. And then business email compromise is one that's kind of jumped to the list in terms of the highest financial advantage here in Australia, highest financial losses in Australia. And essentially it uses established relationships between businesses and individuals and business colleagues in order to gain that financial advantage. So it's where offenders impersonate CEOs, companies, suppliers in order to get the money. If we think about fraud statistics, it's billions of dollars that are lost every year. And I don't think everyone really recognises that, or our response to it isn't commensurate with the amount of money that is actually lost. So up here are some stats from 2019. There's no official stats for 2020 as of yet, but the anecdotal evidence suggests that cybercrime skyrocketed in 2020, unsurprisingly. We were all at home, we were all on our computers, we were living our lives virtually, even more so than we do in everyday life. So Australia 2019, $634 million was reported lost. And given that we know reporting is quite low, we know that it's generally less than a third is reported, that's a phenomenal amount. US was $3.5 billion. The Internet Crime Complaint Centre reported that, which is huge. It's not a Western problem, it's not just Australia, US, UK, Canada. Hong Kong police intercepted Hong Kong $3 billion in terms of cybercrime and fraud in 2019. And I guess what I've mentioned around this is it's not just the financial losses, but fraud is so much more. And this statistic only captures a small minority of actual losses. This is kind of my snapshot Fraud 101, 5 key points that we know about fraud. As I've already mentioned, we know it has a very low reporting rate. We know that the majority of victims will not report to police or any other third parties, that they may not know that they're victims, they may be too ashamed and embarrassed to acknowledge that they're victims, they don't see any point in reporting, they don't think they'll get their money back. I have no doubt in this room that there are many of you who have lost money, who have been victims of fraud, and it's very difficult in terms of reporting to get that accurate statistic. We do know that victims have great difficulty in seeking access to what's termed the Fraud Justice Network. So in terms of fraud, there's more than one agency you can report to. Police are obviously one of them, but you can go to banks, you can go to consumer protection agencies, you can go to a range of government, non-government services, and it's very difficult for individuals to navigate that network because there is kind of a lack of responsibility, there's a lack of direction, there's a lack of ownership in the area. And victims will talk about being passed from one agency to another agency to a third agency and still not be able to actually lodge an incident, actually lodge a complaint. We do know that there's a large degree of shame and stigma associated with fraud. A lot of my research with victims, this has been very prominent. Many of the victims that I've spoken to, and I've been fortunate enough to probably speak to over 200 victims in the last 10 years for different projects that I've done, there is such a degree of shame associated with victimisation. This guilt around having been deceived, having sent money, having not realised it. And that's a challenge because Offenders are really good at what they do. Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, hey, I'm going to become a victim of fraud today. And I think we expect sometimes that there's these neon flashing lights over all the fraudulent approaches and people should have seen it coming. And in reality, that's just not the case. As I've already mentioned, we know the impact of fraud is far greater than monetary losses. So victims of fraud will talk about decline in physical health, emotional well-being, varying levels of depression, relationship breakdown, unemployment, homelessness. There was one lady I spoke to a number of years ago. She was living out of her car for 3 months because she'd lost all of her money, her son had disowned her, and she had nowhere else to go. Extreme levels, victims will contemplate or commit suicide. And there are many victims that we know globally who have taken their lives in response to this. And this is me on my little soapbox, but this is so frustrating. There are so many people out there that are suffering devastating losses, and we just don't acknowledge it. We don't acknowledge this as an issue, and we don't talk about it constructively. Which leads to the last point, that fraud is not really a priority of any policing agency. I've written a lot about this. I could do a different talk about this. It's not necessarily their fault. I don't think we can lay any blame at the feet of any police agency. But in terms of policing priorities and political priorities, fraud has never really been on the top 5. If we think about the current state of fraud, it is a high volume crime. It can vary in value, so offenders can sometimes just get small amounts from a lot of people. I mean, if I got the credit card details of everyone in this room and you all even gave me $5, I could get a nice dinner, I could have a good night out. But it does go through to high financial losses. I've spoken to a couple who lost $3.5 million from an investment scheme. I mean, that's a ridiculous amount of money, and I can't even fathom having $3.5 million to lose. But there are victims out there that lose substantial amounts of money, and that's life-changing. A large amount is perpetrated online, and certainly the online environment has enabled fraud to flourish. It's enabled a lot of cyber crimes to flourish. But it's not just online. There's still a large number of fraud that happens over telephone, landlines. For those of you that remember what a landline is, there are some people that still have them, and offenders are using them. Text messages, social media platforms, any means of communication can be used by offenders. We know that policing of fraud is ineffective and unsatisfactory, and that's clearly the case from victims and those trying to access the fraud justice network, but it's equally on the part of police and other agencies. So I've been able to do many interviews with law enforcement and others here in Australia, but also overseas in Canada and the United Kingdom. And there's such a level of almost despair from a number of agencies around seeing the problem, wanting to do something, but not being able to do it based on the system that we're currently in. There is a strong focus on prevention, and that's good. I mean, ideally, we would stop people sending money because that would solve a lot of issues. But the reality is that there will always be fraud victims. There will always be people that lose money, and we can't ignore or deny that. And I think a lot of my work, hopefully, is trying to improve that response. It's acknowledging the fact there will always be victims and we need to do better. And I think one of the challenges with that is that offenders are invisible. They're faceless. We don't know who they are. We don't see them. We can't point a finger at them. We can't arrest them, prosecute them. But the victims, they're right here with us. So instead, we lay blame on them. In terms of the stereotype of who a victim is, I'm sure there are many of you in this room who maybe have some thoughts around that, around who you think is a stereotypical fraud victim. There is this notion that they're older persons, that older persons are more vulnerable and more likely to be victims. And there certainly is a stereotype that victims are greedy, gullible, uneducated, and that they somewhat deserve what happens to them. I would argue very strongly that both are not founded in research, and they're certainly not founded across the work that I've done. I would argue that older victims are attractive targets. So if you think about the goal of offenders, it's around finances. Older people generally have savings. They have access to superannuation. They generally own their own homes and assets. They have good credit ratings. They're attractive. Whereas myself, I'm younger. I have a mortgage, which hopefully I'll pay off at some point. I may have some life savings, but I'm probably not as financially attractive as an older person. So I think it does open them up to that vulnerability, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're more likely to be victims. And we just need to recognise that offenders are highly skilled, tech-savvy individuals that can manipulate victims. We need to put the onus on the individuals perpetrating this, and I'll come back to this later. If we look at what we know, the actual statistics around victimisation, the most likely person to be a victim is anybody. It's around being an individual, being a human. That's what makes you vulnerable to fraud. And that's not really useful when I get asked from police or when I get asked from banks, who should we be targeting? And I say everybody. They don't really like that response. So all persons have a vulnerability or a weakness that, if targeted in the right way at the right time, means that they could be a victim of fraud. And that's everybody in this room, myself included. Everyone in this room has a vulnerability that could make them more susceptible to a fraudulent approach. It won't be the same. I'd hazard a guess that the technical expertise in this room is phenomenal. I don't have that. But there will be other weaknesses and vulnerabilities that you could be open to, you could be susceptible to. We do know that there are some groups and some types of fraud that are related. So obviously, if I go back to the landline experience, younger people don't have landlines. They don't necessarily even know what a landline is. So that's probably not the best way to target them. So telemarketing does target older persons. There are also life events and psychological factors that we know can increase the likelihood of victimisation. But there's no guarantee around these particular factors. There's very limited research around demographics, around psychological attributes, around personality traits that do relate to fraud generally. There's some around particular types of fraud. And I would argue that vulnerability, it's neither fixed nor static. It's really kind of a continuum, and it can change from day to day, from month to month. I've spoken to victims that just professionals were really rushed, going through their emails, trying to clear their inboxes. We all know that feeling. And just reading an email, not really processing it properly, responding to it, and giving access to all of their bank account information to an offender. It can happen. In 2019, the Australian Competition Consumer Commission released what I think is a really great demographic, just breaking down the top 3 fraud categories for all demographics. So this really speaks to the point that everyone is vulnerable. So you've got under 18s are vulnerable, but they're vulnerable to different things compared to the over 65s. So unsurprisingly, under 18s are vulnerable to online shopping fraud because we're all spending our lives going through eBay, going through various sites. And you can see 18 to 24, it's around threats to life. In the media periodically, we see stories particularly targeting Chinese university students, probably not so much post-COVID times, but previously there were a number of schemes going around where Chinese students were being threatened with deportation. If they didn't work with the offender, they would send photos of themselves being kidnapped to their families and friends back home, arguing that they needed money in order to be released. And that was specifically targeting, a particular demographic in the community. And that's the highest category for that particular age group. That won't work for older age groups. So offenders are very good at targeting and tailoring approaches that they think will work. If we look up to the older demographics, it's all around romance, it's all around investment. This was 2019, so 2018 data, but I'd hazard a guess to say it's quite similar now. If we think about why fraud is successful, it's around the fact that offenders are highly skilled, tech-savvy individuals. They know what they're doing. They know how to identify someone's weakness, they know how to manipulate it, and they know how to exploit it. And I've seen it time and time again, not just in the stories of the victims I've spoken to. I've seen it in the email communications. I've seen it in the text messages, in the chat logs that victims have shared with me. I've seen how offenders get in and they just know exactly what to do and what to say at any given time. We do know that offenders work in groups to target victims, and this is, interesting in terms of, from a victim perspective, sometimes they've said to me that they feel they're talking to more than one person. So it's kind of the one person, it might be Cassandra that they're talking to, but Cassandra has multiple personalities in real life as well as online. And And the victim can figure out that, or they just have this inkling that they're not talking to the same person. They have this idea that they're talking to multiple people depending on the time of day. But they also they bring different characters in. There can be kind of the person they're communicating with, there can be family, there can be professionals, there can be doctors. They'll bring people in order to try and get what they want. Offenders will bombard victims with communications. So for a lot of the victims that I talk to, during the time that they're being defrauded, they talk about it as being all-consuming, because essentially from when they wake up in the morning to when they go to bed at night, they're communicating with the offender in some way, whether it's over email, whether it's over text message, whether it's actual phone calls. It's just constant communication. So I remember one victim spoke to me around the fact that she turned off her mobile phone. She just needed a break. She turned it back on and she had 130 missed calls from the offender. I mean, it's ridiculous in terms of just the way that they communicate, the way that it becomes all-consuming. We do know that offenders also have answers for any questions, and this is what makes it really hard and really challenging for those on the outside. As a family member, as a friend, as law enforcement, to have a conversation with someone who's on the inside and try and have a rational conversation. You can't have a rational conversation around an irrational situation. I've spoken to victims who have told me that later on that day they're going to the post office and they're going to transfer more money. There was one guy in particular I remember in Perth, and he had lost a couple of $100,000. He was living in a big mansion, he was in Housing Commission. He was still sending money on the off chance that it was real, that he would get his money back, and that afternoon he was going to Australia Post to send his pension. I mean, it's just heartbreaking that this happens, and it's difficult on the outside to try and understand that, to try and understand how the person still sends that money. And it goes to the last point, that victims don't really believe they're susceptible to fraud. I think sometimes it's easier to send money with the hope that it's real than it is to actually acknowledge the fact that you have been deceived, that you have trusted someone and that they have exploited that. If we think about techniques of offending, offenders are really smart. They know what to do. So many will use social engineering techniques, and many of you in this room are probably familiar with those, with authority. Offenders will take on positions of authority, whether that's CEOs in business email compromise fraud, whether that's military personnel in romance fraud. They will use this notion of authority. We get text messages from banks or from the ATO kind of demanding. I got a missed call from the ATO the other day telling me there was an arrest warrant out for me because I hadn't paid my tax. I know that that's not true, but that can really scare some people if they don't know what actually happens. They use urgency, they use scarcity in order to get someone to do an immediate reaction, to respond immediately without thinking. And then a lot of my work, and an area I'm really interested in, is the use of psychological abuse that offenders use. So I have done some work where I've identified that offenders use the same psychological abuse techniques that we know offenders use in domestic violence. The same techniques that are being perpetrated within DV, I would argue offenders are using that in a fraud context. And offenders are able to wield a huge amount of power and control on a person's life, even though they're not geographically in the same place. An offender can be on the other side of the world, and they can still exert an incredible amount of power and control and fear on the lives of the victims here. I've had several victims that have moved house at the end of their experience because they didn't feel safe in their house, they didn't feel comfortable, the offender knew too much about them. And offenders are really good at using these techniques. And that's why it's hard. It's hard, I guess, on the inside when you're in that to experience it, and it's hard on the outside to see what's happening to somebody. In terms of technology, technology has really enabled fraud to flourish. It's enabled a number of cybercrimes to flourish. The internet didn't create fraud. It didn't create any of these things. The Nigerian example has been around for a very long time. It used to be through fax machines, if we remember what they are. But it's exponentially increased the ability for offenders to target victims. It's increased their potential victim pool. Technology creates many barriers for victims and law enforcement. I think everyone in this room is aware of that. There are many technological efforts in place to reduce fraud victimisation, and I certainly don't need to talk technical to those in the room. There are spam filters, antivirus, algorithms, chatbots, artificial intelligence. There's a lot of research happening in that area in the fraud space. But regardless of the best technology, fraud still has that human element. And being human is what makes you fallible to fraud. So wrapping up, if you take anything away from today, hopefully it's just perhaps a different understanding of what fraud victimisation is. It's understanding that it's not always Nigerian princes or Nigerian astronauts. It's not people responding to these outrageously crazy emails, but offenders are very good at targeting individual vulnerabilities and weaknesses and getting in there and exploiting them in any way possible. We need to acknowledge that all of us in this room are potentially vulnerable to fraud. And that's not to scare everybody. I do a lot of presentations to older people, so it's always hard to talk about this without scaring older people to never turning on their computers ever again. And that's not my aim. But we have to be real about this. We have to acknowledge the fact that there will be victims in this room, people who have responded, and there's potentially, if we come back next year, there'll be people that have experienced this in the next 12 months. We need to accept that the most sophisticated technical expertise does not necessarily protect you against fraud. And I think that's certainly one of the challenges that I face in terms of working, trying to do collaborations with technical people. An app is not going to change everything. And we need to talk openly and constructively about fraud with family, friends and colleagues. If somebody came to you and said that they'd lost $300,000, how would you react to that? I mean, inside and outside. I think what I would just encourage, if anything, is to have these discussions with your family and friends about the different approaches, about the different things that are out there, so that you potentially are a trusted person. If someone does lose money, if someone is unsure about what's happening, that they might come to you knowing that you won't judge them, you won't disown them, but that you will just sit down and have that probably difficult, uncomfortable conversation with someone. And I can only really encourage you to be supportive of those people. Sometimes it's hard, sometimes they're not ready to hear it, but at some point they will need support, and it would be brilliant if it was everyone in this room. So that's it for today. If you've got any questions, I think there's a few minutes available. My email's up there, I'm on Twitter. Can somebody please tweet about this, or it probably didn't happen. And I'll be around for the next 2 days. Thank you.
We do have a few questions. One of the first questions is on scam baiters, and scam baiters are people that tag scammers along, almost scamming the scammers. And the question is by Alex: what are your thoughts on scam baiters and vigilantes?
That's a very good question. I think it was Alex. I have written a paper on this, but I'm a bit conflicted about scam baiters, to be perfectly honest. I can see the reasons why people do it, and I can see in some cases it's quite harmless, and I certainly understand the premise of, I guess if they're talking with you and you know what's happening, then they're not talking with somebody else who might be sending money. The issue that I do have with scam baiting is that there's a fine line between kind of the harmless type of scam baiting and the scam baiting that I've seen that very much draws upon misogynistic, sexist, racist kind of undertones. So there's a number of forums out there. I've done some analyses of some of these forums, and I guess there's different types of scam baiting, and I guess there's also, I think this would be a great research project. It's on my to-do list. But I think, yeah, I'm definitely conflicted. I can understand it. I wouldn't encourage it myself, because I guess for me, as soon as you're engaging with an offender, you're giving them an opening. And you might think you're invincible, and you might well be, but you may also have at some point a vulnerability that they identify and they get in. So for me, it's always about not engaging in any circumstances.
Yeah, great. Another question. This is an interesting one by Ben Waters. What do you think what are the reasons for the disparity between fraud losses in Canada versus Australia, given that they're similarly sized Commonwealth countries?
I think it's around reporting and statistics. So those statistics do seem quite low. When I was putting them together, they do seem quite low compared to Australia. Australia has improved in terms of its reporting. So it used to just be ScamWatch reporting ScamWatch figures, but ScamWatch now includes reports from ACORN. What used to be ACORN, the Australian Cybercrime Online Reporting Network, is now Report Cyber. So they include those statistics. They also include statistics from the big 4 banks in their most recent publication. So I think it's really just around knowledge and around statistics. I think in Canada, my understanding is it's just reports to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre. And I think if they were to do similar things in terms of including other categories and other organisations, that it would probably be a much higher statistic. But generally speaking, we know that the stats are only a very small minority of actual losses. So any statistic, any figure we put out there is not really going to be representative of the actual harm and loss.
And Cynic has just asked a general question. Are the slides and information going to be shared? There are some great statistics and info available in those slides.
Yeah, I'm happy to share those statistics. As I said, I've been in this area a while. I've written a lot. So if any of you are interested, I've got conversation articles that are short and snappy, and I've got academic articles that may put you to sleep. And I'm happy to share either.
And maybe one last question by Benzies. How do you handle fraud in the age of massive data leaks? Recently, Facebook and LinkedIn, where key PII identifiers are in that data and do not require traditional methods.
Yeah, it's definitely challenging in terms of, I guess, technology and the way that offenders are always figuring out how to use things for evil. So every time we come up with, or technology evolves into something useful and convenient for us, there's always kind of a flip side where offenders will use it for evil. So I don't necessarily have a concrete answer for that, but it is a challenge around identity crime. I've been starting to think about the use of deep fakes in romance fraud, for example. So if people are creating deep fake images and using them as profile pictures, then it removes the identity crime of real people. So instead of taking real people's pictures and using them, they're creating kind of fictitious people, but it opens up a whole new range of problems and issues. So for me, it's just there's always a counter argument to any good thing. There's always something for evil. And I think the problem with me and with many of you in this room is that we think about the bad stuff. We're kind of paranoid around all the evil that can happen out there.
Well, thank you very much for those questions and your presentation. So let's all thank Cassandra one more time.
Thank you.